Okay, so big welcome to everyone. Really great to see you all here today for today's South East Community of Practice session. We're going to have a good focus on mental health support for our children in care. And I want to kind of start off by saying that this session brings together the result of a fantastic collaborative working with colleagues across health and other parts of the system. So we are hugely grateful to them. We had over 100, almost 130 people register for today's event, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you during the course of this session. So today's session, like I said, is being video recorded, and we will subsequently add it to our website in order that it can be made available for people that haven't been able to attend today. And just in terms of practicalities, like I say, we ask that you please turn your cameras off and your microphones off, as this will limit any interference, because we do have a large number of people gathered with us today, which is really great. And there'll be opportunities for you to contribute, to raise questions and comments throughout today. So after each of the presenters have spoken, there'll be opportunity for you to raise your hands via the icon in order to raise any ideas or questions that you might have. We also encourage you to use the chat bar. And again, we'll periodically, raise any kind of emergent themes or questions that are being raised via that mechanism. And so I think that covers pretty much the practicalities. Welcome very much to our first guest speaker, Andrea King, who I must say has been the absolute driving force, who's led this piece of work and has been a real engine. We're hugely thankful to Andrea for all that she's done in relation to the work that you'll hear more about this morning. Andrea's worked in children's services for many years, across the voluntary sector, central government, and providing leadership in local authorities. And most recently, she is an assistant director for NHS England, providing leadership support to the most senior partnership leaders to improve the redesign of mental health services for children and young people in the South East and South West. So we're, like I say, hugely grateful to Andrea and the other guest speakers today. And on that matter, I'll pass over to Andrea then, if that's okay. Welcome, Andrea.
Sharon, thank you so much. It's really lovely, everybody, to be with you today. And Sharon has described really that this has been an endeavour of both hearts and minds, I would say. I don't know about you, Sharon, across the South East. It's been a real partnership with IRA managers, with our directors of children's services, CCG commissioners and our CAMS leadership, to try and come together to say what could we do better for children in care, recognising that we're corporate parents for those children. The other key bit for us was really thinking about mental health access and support for children in care. We know our children in care have often had much more experience of trauma and other adversity than other colleagues, other children that we work with. And so this was a chance to say, what could we do together? I'm going to try and share some slides with you now, just two brief slides which will give you a bit of a summary of what we've been trying to do. This started way back at the beginning of Wave 1 lockdown. In March of last year, we became aware that some of our children in care, particularly those who were placed outside of their local authority of origin, were having real difficulties accessing emotional mental health support. And actually, for the other end of the country, we had some experience of children in care being flat refused mental health support, which we never had such clear refusal of those services before. And we followed every child through to make sure that they got what they needed. But I think it would be fair to say that we were really concerned that that was the start of lockdown and then what might happen through the rest of lockdown for our children in care. So we work with central government, we work with NHS England national team and with Department for Education to say, could you help us to do something about this? I'm really pleased to say that all 19 directors of children's services and lead members for children's services across the South East said, look, we'll help. And all of our CCG, they're the commissioners who hold the money, who design things like our mental health services and all kinds of other things. They all said, and all of our CAMS providers said, will help, for which we were so grateful. And we started really with listening to the experience of our children, both children in care and care leavers, and huge thanks to those of you in this room who helped us to do that through relationships of trust that often you were holding as IROs, because your role is so pivotal. And I'm really appreciative of Sharon and Pritpal's support with Lindy right at the outset to say, yes, as an IRO South East team, we'll help with this because you're so crucial. We've had a lot of support from Anna Freud, Local Government Association and others. The Association of Directors of Children's Services are now rolling out nationally what we've designed in the last 9 months in the South East. So what you need to know is that what we've co-designed together here in our region has rolled out all over the country. We've tried to keep it manageable. So we said, look, there are some phase 1 things that everyone in the South East agreed to do together. And then there is a phase 2, which is just for those who feel ready to get involved at that level. So here's just one slide that summarises those phases. In phase 1, which we completed in December, 4th of December 2020, we worked with all of those systems leaders to say, what is our ambition for our children in care? Can we as partnership leaders say, this is the kind of mental health support we want our children in care to receive? And then can we be a bit honest about, for each of our areas, what's the gap for them? So some areas can meet that ambition straight away and some can't. And for those that can't, it's a job of myself and people like Gavin, Lockhart and others who you'll hear from later to help CAMS leaders and CCGs to kind of close that gap on mental health provision, particularly for children in care, but of course for all children. The other thing we've introduced is a tariff system co-designed with the people who hold the money, that's the CCGs, to say we've got to stop this system of overcharging. What you may have picked up through statutory care planning and review is that sometimes we're being charged 10 times as much for assessment or treatment for our children in care as a standard rate would be when they're placed out of area. And we said very clearly that's got to stop. And we've been really successful at stopping that within the South East, and the tariff is now rolling out nationally. That matters, because that money in the pot is to buy the support that we need for our children, that those children really need. And so that's been a significant change in the health system. We've also agreed roles and responsibilities, and that's really helped reduce the number of disputes that have arisen between partnership agencies for children in care and between different areas where our children are placed out of area. It doesn't mean it's perfect. We just had an example of a child placed in Bolton just a few weeks ago where something had gone really wrong. But by using these arrangements, we were able to resolve the matter within 24 hours. And our previous experience has been that's often taken us several weeks to resolve. So these tools are really helping us. The other thing for you to know, and thank you so much for your help with this, you might remember me nagging about a few questions for every IRO to draw out your experience of overseeing care planning and review. What was working well in your local area for children in care and what wasn't working? Your feedback has been crucial. And we've sent a summary for every local authority area of your children in care population, what your children's needs are, what their emotional mental health needs are, what's really good in your local areas, and what could do with some rethinking key strategic questions. Your feedback as IROs is in those summaries. So the most senior leaders and the commissioners, the people who design these mental health services, we've specifically talked with them about what you are seeing. So what you've said and your professional view will make a difference to the systems and services designed for our children in care, mental health services for children in care. Some of you will have received invitations now from CTG commissioners saying we actually want to design something new for our children in care in our area for their mental health services where you didn't really have anything before. So that's the kind of difference your words have made. Dr. Gavin Lockhart and Lee Atkins have worked really closely on what's in this middle strand here, the community of practice tools. And you will all have in your emails, probably more than once, we apologise for that, the clinical guide, which talks about what does the evidence say, what are the tools you can use, what are the kind of different approaches you can use to really understand the emotional mental health needs for your children in care. And then what's likely to be most helpful for your child in care, depending on what their experience, history and need is, at all levels, from early help through to what we've described as quite specialist and forensic services. It's all in one place for you, and we've done that design work in the South East, but again, that's rolling out all over the country. So we're going to spend most of our time today talking about that guide and walking you through it and listening to what you have to say. I'll just very briefly mention phase 2, which is for the brave and the bold, as we've described it. There are two main parts to this. Some of your local authority areas have stepped forward to say, we would like to have a brand new system design conversation with health, with people like me in NHS England. Could we design from the outset for our children in care some residential provision that enables both mental health services and social welfare services to sit side by side. That's the first time that's been done. We're riding on the back of the CESLIP children in care complex lack work. And the areas that will lead us in that are Kent, Portsmouth, West Sussex and Milton Keynes. If you're not in that list, don't worry, that's just where we're starting. And we're putting, in essence, our NHS money and money from the Directors of Children's Services together, having a mature conversation with providers to say, what could we do? So that's part of phase 2. The second half of phase 2 actually is going to apply to everybody, but we didn't know that at the outset. We are working with your adult mental health leaders to design care leaver mental health services. So specific, bespoke care leaver mental health provision as part of the community mental health transformation. There's new money for that coming into the health economy. So that will benefit everyone, and it responds to what our children in care and care leavers through your support have told us they need. And that's going to take us, because both of these pieces of work are really big pieces of co-design. We're re-engineering the system. It's going to take us about a year or two to get from where we are now to seeing the product of those services. But we'd love to work in partnership with you as we do that design. So I hope that gives you enough of a summary of all this work that's been happening across the South East to try and support our children in care. And if there are any questions at all, anything you'd like to kind of ask me, please do place them in the chat. And through the course of today, please do keep posting the questions and thoughts that you have. We can talk together and we'll produce a frequently asked questions document with Sharon and Pritpal after today. I hope that's been helpful for everybody.
Thanks so much, Andrea. That's really, really helpful. Okay, we're running a little bit behind time, but as Andrea says, do place your questions in the chat. I'm going to move on now then to welcome Beverly Barnett-Jones to talk about inequalities between ethnic groups and the proportions of children being looked after in care in England. And Beverly, we're really pleased to have Beverly join us today. Beverly is an Associate Director for Practice and Impact at the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Beverly has a wealth of experience. Beverly was previously on the front line of children's social care for a considerable number of years.
Don't say how many years.
I thought you might say that. No. And she was previously on the front line, and she was, and she led the development of the Family Time Therapeutic Model, a community-based adolescent support hub, and the Black Country FDAC Tri-Borough collaboration. She received an MBE in June 2018 for her work with children and families. And like I say, I'm absolutely delighted, thrilled to have Beverly join us today. So over to you then, Beverly.
Yeah, hi, Sharon. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be available today. And Andrew King, I must talk to you because I'm so excited by what I heard there in terms of integrated systems. So it was beautiful to hear that work. I'm just going to try and hopefully see if I can share my screen. Because I'm not brilliant with Teams because we tend to use Zoom in the office. Can people see my screen?
Yes. I
certainly
can.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to go and put it onto the slideshow, if I can remember how to do this. That's it, from the beginning. Okay, right. So there's a few slides here, but I'm going to whistle stop through them because really what I wanted to do is give a chance for people to ask me questions because I can't stay until the end, Sharon. I have to leave after Rachel to do the presentation. So today I'm just going to give you a whistle stop through ethnic, racial disparity and disproportionality for children looked after. Is it all in the data? And this is something which we've been working on for the NFGO because we're very interested in what is happening with children before they enter or pass through the family justice system on their journeys. And we've been working quite closely with the Child Welfare Inequalities Project. So a lot of this data is obviously coming from them. So I want to make sure I cite that work. So, as I said, just a brief presentation and hopefully a discussion about what the relevance of this is when we're thinking about the needs of children who are looked after in the care system. Just a note on language. We are reliant on government administration, census or other forms of data collection, and they use a language which some of us probably would object to. But when we're referring to terms such as Asian, Indian or Black African, it's important to note that these are artificial labels and don't actually reflect the range of diversity within groups, never mind between groups. We know how important language is because it does offer that issue around normative views of family life and caregiving. So it isn't a world that I think as a social worker I would have ever stayed in, but in this world we are reliant upon that kind of constructions, but we have to always think, what does that really mean and what are the experience of people when we're talking about young people in terms of classes of groups. So just briefly, I was just going to take you a little bit to something that we are working on as a kind of systems mapping, which is looking at, for our infographic, children who are entering the family justice system, what do we know about them? And these are children who obviously would have been made subject to either care orders or would have been made subject to secure orders or other interventions, including restriction of liberty applications, and they all come into the data that we're trying to examine. Just a couple of slides from that. What I really wanted to highlight to you really this presentation is what we know but how much we don't know. And this graphic kind of shows you that where we have grey, that means that it's partially known. Where we have white, that means the data can tell us the answer to certain questions. And where it's pitched as black, we have no information at all. We don't know. And I just wanted to draw your attention to children and their families entering the family justice system. So that's at the point of children moving into the care system and maybe applications being made into courts, either while they're Section 20 accommodated or an application being made around a child being removed from a family. And you can see here, based on national government data, we've got a kind of partial picture of the ethnicity of those children who come into the family justice system. So we don't even have some of the basic national data doesn't collect. That's CAFCAS data, primarily, that's MOJ data, actually doesn't collect consistently the ethnicity of children who are coming into the system. You might find that quite amazing, but that is the state of the national data at the moment. We're hoping that the new census that we're going to be linking to will give us a really good, better picture of some of those population linkages that we can make. But at the moment, we're in a world where we actually don't know on national data the ethnicity of children who are entering the family justice system. Just quickly again, you can see here again, children comes into the family justice system. What's the children's ethnicity? Again, the box shows you it's grey. We don't have a complete picture. And on our infographic, we look at what's going on before young people or children are entering the family justice system, what's going on in their lives, in their engagement with children's social services or others. And again, you can see here, there's a whole blank. We don't have a national picture really of what support's been provided, what's going on in terms of parenting support. We don't know much about support from parental mental health, although we're getting a bit better in that because we've got a data linkage process in Wales, which really is helping us understand the parents of children who are coming into the family justice system, what that mental health picture looks like. We've recently published work from 1,000 women in Wales, which looked at the clear links between women whose children are being removed and their history of mental illness and being involved in mental health systems as young people, and that's really powerful information. Just a quick word on terms. So when we think about disproportionality and disparity, you see these words being interchanged, but they are slightly different. The disproportionality refers to the ratio between the percentage of a person in a particular racial and ethnic group at a particular point in time, such as if there's been an incident of maltreatment and you're looking at evidence or schools exclusion, or in this case, entry into care, compared to the percentage of the same racial ethnic group in the overall population. So that's your disproportionality. Your disparity refers to a state of being unequal. So in health and social care systems, disparities typically used to describe unequal outcomes experienced by one racial or ethnic group when compared to another racial or ethnic group. So really here we are talking about inequalities. Just a simple slide here. All of you probably would have seen this. All of you who are IROs would know that DFA publishes general data about children looked after. This is the last publication in February 2019. And it just gives you a very sort of a blank picture of the proportionality story. So you've got a situation of, I'll just focus on looked after children who are the light blue. You'll see that 74% of that population are described as white. And in terms of the under 18 population in general, it's 79%. So they make up 79% of the general population. If you look at classification of black, this is even worse, this data set, to be honest, because it doesn't even break things down very well for you. But you'll see again, the under 18 population of categories of black is 5%. The presentation of black in the looked after system is 8%. Similarly, in terms of Asian community, you have 10% of under 18 population, and 4% again in terms of the looked after population. I'm not talking about your adoption figures because they're so small really, they don't really take us very far. But that just gives you a really bold picture of what it looks like. There's an overrepresentation in terms of general population, the number of black children or the number of Asian children or the number of mixed heritage children who are entering the care system, becoming looked after. It's a picture of disproportionality. But what do we actually know from the data about the inequalities of the rates of children looked after? And this is really the work that Child Welfare Inequality Project has been doing. And we're doing some work with them about converting some of their very complex analysis into a lovely animation that could be used by social workers and used by trainers and teachers and IROs to really get to grips with how you can look at your local data to make the analysis, because some of the work they publish can get a bit complicated. But basically, the general picture is white British children are 10 times more likely to be in care than Asian, Indian children. Black and Caribbean children are 20 times more likely to be in care. Asian children overall are almost 3 times less likely to be in care than white children, almost 4 times less likely to be in care than black children. That's the kind of findings of 4 years of their work that they've been doing at local data level analysis. Because you cannot get this picture from the national data, because you can see I've told you the national data is really, really patchy. But when you study local data with the local data collections, neighbourhood data, put that against deprivation indexes, match that with the census, you can start to generate some much more granular information about what is actually going on for groups of young children as they become looked after. So when we think about the disparities issue, there are different types of experiences for Asian children. So there's a disproportionate number of children from Bangladeshi, Pakistani backgrounds as opposed to Asian Indian. These are categories that are used in the census. Yeah. And what they found is that if you link that alongside Caribbean and African children of Caribbean African backgrounds, you'll see that those children who are entering the system are coming from disadvantaged neighbourhoods, and around 3/4 of all children from this group lived in the most deprived 40% of neighbourhoods in England, while white British and Asian Indian children were distributed more evenly. And Indian children are really the least subjected to children's services interventions across the work that they did over the last 4 years. What they determined this to be was this thing called the social gradient, which looks at really the neighbourhood that you live in is a big influencing factor as to whether you're going to be a child who ends up in the systems of care. But it's a very complicated picture because although income deprivation and household deprivation are really correlated, they're not causal. So when you look at the picture of children looked after, it's quite a complex picture, and I'm going to try and hopefully explain this to you. So black children who live in high deprivation neighbourhoods are much less likely actually than white British children to be taken into care or to be on a protection plan. But in low deprivation neighbourhoods, where there are fewer numbers of black children, they are more likely than white children to be in care. So something is going on there. If you're in a neighbourhood where it's quite a highly deprived neighbourhood, you're seeing less overrepresentation or less disparity of black African and black Caribbean children in the system. But if you conversely go to an area of lower levels of deprivation, you're seeing a serious overrepresentation of the black children and black Caribbean children in those neighbourhoods. And that's a really interesting thing because I think that takes us to somewhere where the discussion needs to go, but I'll get back to that. Black Caribbean children in particular at all levels of neighbourhood deprivation are more likely than white British children to be in care. And amongst 16 and 17-year-olds, one black Caribbean child in 30 was in care compared to 1 in 100 white British children. And that was data taken at 2018. And we know we're going to get an update from the CWIP at the end of this year on those figures. So what we have there is that if you look at a disproportionality lens, it tells us two things. It tells us that black children are disproportionately overrepresented in the rates of children in care. And second, that poor children are disproportionately overrepresented in rates of children in care. So the data seems pretty clear that more black children are living in poverty, so therefore more children in care are black. That seems to be what you could draw as a conclusion. But it gets a bit more complicated than that. Because as I said before, in poor neighbourhoods, the rates of black children in care are actually lower than the rates of white children in care, and that in more affluent neighbourhoods, the opposite is true. And I think this is where, for my colleagues said, where the real debate or discussion needs to be. Why is that happening? What are the explanations for this? Now, I've been working at the NFDO for us to start to open up a conversation about intersectionality and intersectional racism, because I am sort of putting out an idea that when we look at the family justice system, it is just at the end of the stream of what goes on before, and we don't know anything about the children that come into the family justice system, and we don't know how different children experience the family justice system. But one of the things that we do know is there is something going on here around intersectional racism. That's the position I've taken, and thankfully my director is saying, okay, let's dig into that and let's look at that as a big issue. So the evidence that suggests that ethnic disproportionality, it's more to do with service side inequality. So it's likely that this is not about what's going on in particular families. It is not what that report that came out a couple of weeks ago reported. It's not about families and their structures. It's not about their cultures. It's not about their behaviours. It's not about their lack of aspirations. It's not about any of that stuff. It's really about what is going on in terms of the service intervention and service response to different groups of communities and different types of families. So there's, in the view of CWIP, there's a service side inequality issue here. And that's likely to be around policy frames, some cultures and beliefs and practices that could be reproducing ethnic inequalities and how families are being provided for and responded to. And I can speak to that in terms of my experience of being a social worker, as Sharon said, for many, many years, where I've often heard the story of, oh, you don't need to really be bothering giving support to that particular family because they look after their own. Or they'll do that, they'll look after their own. There are all these kind of racist tropes that are there that really affect the way that we think about policy frames, the way that we can practice and the way that we make decisions. And although lots of work has gone on around challenging those ideas, something is happening in the way that services are behaving and responding to children that is telling us that we've got something fundamental to address, and how we address that through research is what I'll come to. But I just want to give you a real example of this, which is the issue of mixed heritage children, which has been a big story in the children looked after system, the care system for many years. If you look at the rates of looked at rates of mixed heritage children, what you find is this: when you look across a representative sample, as CWIP did, you look at the scale of deprivation indicated for white children, and it sort of showed that at the highest scale of deprivation, white children are 4 times more likely to be in care than in an average neighbourhood. For black Gavin children in the same neighbourhoods, the gradient was lower for deprivation. It was 188. However, for mixed heritage children, the deprivation was the same as 3.89. It was the same as for white children. But what you found was there was up to 1.7 to 3.4 times higher than white British children at any point of the scale that came into the system. So you had this kind of double impact of a mixed heritage child in the same neighbourhood as white children was elevating up into the system of care. And there is something really important there about how we are working with and understanding the needs of that particular group, which is a growing population in our society, but a growing population in the care system. So what does this all mean? There's strong evidence of disproportionality and disparity between different ethnic groups of children who are becoming looked after. There's disparity. This disparity is intersectional because it involves class, but it also involves ethnicity, deprivation, and in brackets race. The picture of why some black and brown children are overrepresented does seem to be related to service response, which may be over-surveilling families, but also neglecting families. A classic is if you use the CWI app, which is available online, you'll find some really interesting pictures of just how underrepresented black children are in the looked after system in places and spaces where you would have expected the index of deprivation to put them up higher. So there was something going on there about how the system sees the protection and needs of groups of children, in my view. So what's next for us? So we're sort of talking about the need for more qualitative and ethnographic research to get to that granular level of what's going on systemically in decision making around the children's services response, which seems to be reproducing inequality. Very little is known about the experience of black and racialised ethnic minority children through and after care and their outcomes. I asked one of our researchers to research around black children, their mental health, and the care system. There's very little research there. There's very little work being done since 2000. And one of the questions I will ask for any frame is, are we framing that experience of racism and trauma when we think about the mental health needs of looked after children who may be of an ethnic minority background and are experiencing that? That's a question I would always ask. From an FGO point of view, we want to keep building partnerships like with Sharon and others to enable a direction and lead on what type of research questions need to be asked and how do we get the funding for that research to happen. Because IROs hold massive amount of knowledge about young people because you follow them through. So we want to work more closely with you to actually get a picture of what is happening and how are we understanding the needs of black and other children of racialised backgrounds, how we understand them. So for me, that's why I came here today. Hopefully, I've gone a bit faster now because the time's short, but the slides are going to be there for you. There is a real issue here about disproportionality. There is a real issue about disparity. But the key issue is that there's something going on within the system that we are all part of, that we are managing and we are making decisions in, that seems to be reproducing inequalities. And obviously, anti-racist stance, positive stances are all really important, but I think this is even deeper in terms of how we really get to the evidence and the research we need to actually either support these ideas that might be happening and what policy changes and what frameworks we need to put in place to ensure that children who do become looked after are getting equal treatment in the system.
Beverly,
yeah.
Thanks so much. That's absolutely brilliant. So much information and things to think about there. Sorry, I'm echoing here. I don't know if I'm echoing your end or here. But yeah, lots to think about there. And as you quite rightly say, NIRAMP are really, really keen. We've been working with the Nuffield in thinking about next steps, because there is something here about policy, isn't there? Just as Beverly has been saying, but there's also something about practice and culture and what we can do, within the system and within our IRO roles to address that. So in terms of questions, we are a little bit short of time. I'm not seeing any hands up at the moment, but what I'm going to do is turn to Pritpel just to see whether there's anything coming up within the threads, Pritpel, that we want to share at this stage.
I think people have just shared that they found it really interesting and something to take back. One of the questions that I put on there is the length of time in care or on a child protection plan, or the outcome, that you might receive in the criminal justice system also different? Because I imagine it might be.
Because when you look at the Child Pornography Project, it picks up children who are looked after, but it also picks up children on child protection plans, and it sees a similar sort of disparity. In terms of youth justice system, the data is much better there because they collect the data much more cleanly. So the national data clearly shows you massive disparity and massive overrepresentation, from sentencing to disposals to diversion plan. They are all indicating issues around racialised disparities and ethnic sort of inequalities happening there. I think for our point of view, we are building and working very hard with the DfE and MOJ to get the data, to get the national administrative data to reflect the population, because it's supposed to be the data that reflects the population, and it misses significant parts of the population who are then overrepresented, at the sharp end of where the state intervenes in family life. So it's really important. It's a justice question for us. We're not sort of just data bods. We're interested in it because data shapes investment, shapes policy, and ultimately, it should be the framework for our understanding of practice, and, for me, as Sharon knows, that's where my heart is, in that practice front. And I think that you can do more in that practice front, and we can think about how we can work together to collect local data, because if you can get your local data together and you can get a framework around that, you can do so much within the current resources that you have, because you're asking those questions. So I know I was sort of rushing through a bit, but I did say, if you're designing something around mental health and children looked after, have you got a lens there on the impact of trauma, of racism and racist experience? I mean, this is something which I know that young black children who have left care years ago, when I was more actively involved, would often talk about their experience of racism and it just not being recognised in how they were being cared for in their care arrangements. So there's also sort of like, give a lot of love and it'll all be okay, but it wasn't a real recognition of what hung on that did to people in terms of their psychological well-being. So these are the things, even though if you don't have quite yet the data to support it, what the right thing is. So, let's think about it in terms of developing the practice, and then let the practice generate the research questions for the research to go away. And as we say, co-produce or co-work together to produce some really good evidence, which we're going to do, because Sharon knows I'm absolutely obsessed about what's going on with black boys in this system at the minute, what's happening with inherent jurisdiction, restriction and secure. So we really want to get into some of our bigger survey work that we do with MyRock. That's one of the plans we've got, Sharon, that we're going to come back with a survey for you.
Absolutely brilliant question, Pritpal, and as you both know, we've got a whole work stream, centred around that, very issue, and as Bev quite rightly says, we're, working together really, closely to, address those really, big issues going forward. That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for asking to come, Sharon. I wish I could stay for the rest of the day, because I in my old practice head, I was so pleased to hear what you've been doing in this work. So obviously we can chat about it a bit more, Sharon. But again, we are interested in featuring system change work when it's around young people. And this is obviously a massive piece of one of the biggest issues we have very little national data about the mental health of children who are coming into family justice, who then go on to be looked after. So this work that you're doing is just absolutely vital in terms of system change work. So congratulations to the South East and all of you, and Andrea, getting those CCGs in. I mean, you've done a brilliant job there. Absolutely brilliant. Finally recognising that our young people need something different and special for them. It's brilliant. So thanks for inviting me, Sharon. I really enjoyed it.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Bev. Have a great
Bye.
day. Thank you.
Bye.
Sorry, just managed to put myself on mute. I'm just saying wonderful. We're going to move on now then to introduce a big welcome to Dr. Gavin Lockhart. So Gavin is an honorary lecturer for mental health practice and psychology at the University of Sussex. Gary is also an associate fellow of the British Psychological Society, chartered clinical psychologist, accredited cognitive behavioural psychotherapist and accredited interpersonal therapy practitioner, and has a considerable number of years experience of working with children and young people with mental health problems and their families. So a wealth of experience and knowledge. sharing, being shared with us today. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, Gavin, and for your work again on this on this project. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Sharon. I mean, I have to say in advance, this was very much a team effort. And we had lots of fantastic input from lots of different people. So it really wouldn't have been possible without that whole team effort. Sharon, thank you for the introduction. I'm not quite sure where you got all that information from, but it's very, very flattering. In terms of the context, a bit more of my background, setting the context for what I'm going to talk about today. So my current main roles are as a clinical lead for children and young people's mental health across the South East, and that's with both NHS England and with Health Education England. So very much thinking about not just service delivery and setup, but also thinking about the workforce needs to best support the mental health and emotional wellbeing needs of the young people in our region. Just in terms of a bit of my background, so right from when I trained, I specialised in working with children and young people in care. I haven't always worked in children and young people in care services, but did have a period of time where I was working in a multi-agency team for several years that was working with young people on the edge of care and in care, and that included some in-reach to one of our secure children's homes in Hampshire, Swanwick Lodge, which some of you may well be familiar with, and during that time did specialise in some attachment-based therapies as well, which probably don't pop up on the CV quite so much nowadays, but so do have that kind of background interest and experience that was drawing on a little bit in pulling this together. So let me put up my slides. Hopefully this will work. Now my Wi-Fi has been quite temperamental this week, so if the sound or video cuts out, if someone can just let me know on the chat bar or come off mute to let me know, that would be great, because otherwise I'll be talking away to a frozen screen. Right, so hopefully this will work. So hopefully you can all see the slides. Would someone mind just letting me know that you can see the slides okay?
Yes, we can, Gavin.
Yeah, super. That's brilliant. So, some of you may well have seen this clinical review and practice guide. It's been quite a while in the making, and to coin Andrew's phrase, it's matured in various ways along the way. So what we're hoping to do over the next 25 minutes, and then Lee will continue a bit of this, is just really helping you to understand what the review is, what the practice guide is, what you can expect in it, and how you might start to utilise it in practice. So we're really hoping just to whet your appetite today for the guide. So structure for the next 20 minutes or so, just to give an overview of what it is, to just talk through what the contents is so that you've got a clear understanding of what you can expect to find in the guide, and then hopefully that will start to shape an understanding of how you might use the guide or how the guide might be of use to you. I think one of the things that has struck us as we've been evolving the guide is that it started off just as a clinical review, and very quickly the practice guide element came into it as well, in terms of really giving some practical pointers for your practice. And I think it quickly became apparent as well that this wasn't just applicable to IROs or even social workers, but is applicable across the whole children and young people's workforce, to anyone that's working with children and young people in the care system. So we're going to go through the contents. One of the things also important just to run through those today, and they cut across any activity to do with recognising, understanding and supporting mental health and emotional wellbeing of children and young people in care, and at all levels actually. So even if you're thinking about service or strategic levels, right the way down to thinking at the level of an individual child or young person. And then if there's time, we'll keep an eye on time, but if there's time, we'll just pull out some key messages that don't overlap too much with Lee's presentation, which is going to be more focused on some of the tools that you might use to start to recognise and understand these issues for young people. And then hopefully I'll have some Q&A time at the end. Please do use the chat bar as you have been on during Beverly's presentation, and I think Andrea and Leah and Pritpal and Sharon are going to keep an eye on that as we go through. And anything we don't have an opportunity to address while we're all here today, we'll try and put together in an FAQ afterwards. So what is this clinical review and guide? So the clinical review and practice guide is focused on how we might recognise, understand, respond, plan and provide support for the mental health and emotional wellbeing needs of our children and young people in care. So as I say, it can be used at a service-wide level, but it can also be used mainly at the level of an individual child or young person. It draws on evidence-based practice, and sometimes people can misconstrue evidence-based practice as just meaning research. And actually, I think evidence-based practice means more than just research. So there are three aspects. Sometimes it's talked about as a three-legged stool. So it does draw on research evidence, our best available research evidence, and most up-to-date research evidence. But it also draws on expert consensus, and that includes expertise of young people who've experienced care and of their caregivers. And the third leg of this evidence-based practice stool is the preferences, wishes and characteristics of the people receiving whatever form of care you're talking about when you're referring to evidence-based practice. So we really have tried to honour that in the way that we put the guide together. And so the guide really collates that to provide this combination of information that will be useful, so sort of awareness raising, but alongside that, recommendations for best practice and some practical tips and tools and resources. So hopefully that sort of expands the utility of this as a document for you to use to support your practice. So just to run through, I'm sorry that this is a bit blurry, I had to do a screen capture, but this is just an overview of what you can expect in the review and in the guide. So I just wanted to go through a few bits of this to give you a flavour. So the initial sections of what you might expect from any of these type of documents. As I've already said, we have some core overarching principles that cut across all of this, which I'm going to come on to in the next slide. The first section then is really just about how you might begin to identify and explore mental health and emotional wellbeing needs and monitor any progress around those or outcomes of any support that's in place for those. So we start off by just contextualising that within a wider understanding of the young person's life. And again, I'll come on to that in a couple of slides' time. But really hosting that in a context. And then there's some really practical tips about how might you or other people who are already in the young person's life start those conversations with them around their mental health and emotional wellbeing. So it just gives some practical tips, some reassurance, I think, in some aspects around how you might start those conversations, how you might navigate those conversations. And that includes some content around self-harm and suicide risk as well, which again, people can sometimes feel quite nervous about broaching, and it provides a bit of a framework for asking more questions around self-harm and suicide risk. It then goes on to talk more about how the types of information that you might use to inform your understanding of a young person's mental health and emotional wellbeing needs, and how we might combine, and again, I don't want to step too much on Lee's presentation because I know he's going to pick up on this, but how we might combine methods there and information from different sources, including the young person, absolutely including the young person. And then towards the end of that section, it focuses more in on mental health and emotional wellbeing in terms of what are the kind of areas that might be really important to include in your exploration with young people and those around them in terms of their mental health and emotional wellbeing. And there are some tools that we are giving as options. So we're not saying you have to use these tools. We're not saying these are the only tools out there, but these are some of the tools that might commonly be used in practice, and many of which have been used with children and young people in care. So we have that confidence that they work for this population of young people. The second section of the review and guide then moves on to planning support, so responding to any mental health and emotional wellbeing needs that might come out of that initial stage. And the first section of that really is focused around building wellbeing and resilience, and I'll come back to the importance of that in a minute, but I think the headline there really is that there is an awful lot, that there's a really solid evidence base behind that can make a massive difference to the mental health and emotional wellbeing of children and young people in care. That is not about specialist input or specialist therapies, but it can have a really profound impact. And even when specialist support or therapies is being provided, that wellbeing and resilience support can sit very well alongside that and really complement it and help to maintain any progress from that. So there's a section around that, and the other headline with that is that can often, most of that can be delivered by people that are already in the young person's life, or people that are accessible through voluntary and community services. So one of the things that we've done in that section is just given some pointers, some bullet points in terms of key areas of support around wellbeing and resilience that some of the research and some of the recommendations for children and young people in care or children and young people with attachment difficulties has drawn out. Moving on to the next section, so this on the right hand side of the screen, there's then a section on healthy attachments. So we know that a significant proportion of young people that are in the care system are going to have had disrupted attachments, but it isn't all about attachment. So there are some pointers there in terms of how you might determine when an attachment focused support could form part of a package of support for the young people. And then it just outlines some evidence-based attachment-focused support. And I think the important thing to say there is that there is some types of support that really do have an evidence base behind them. There are types of support that traditionally young people might have been referred into that don't. There isn't evidence showing they're ineffective, but there's quite mixed or limited evidence that they are effective. And there are absolutely some practices that are outlawed. So we outline each of those in there just to give you some clarity around that, and then finish that section off by thinking about how you might just monitor the impact of any attachment focused support. And then our final section moves on to mental health difficulties and neurodevelopmental difficulties like things like autism and ADHD, and also risk to self or others. So again, we just start off with some points around how might you decide when some specialist support could be useful or could be needed. We talk a little bit about psychological formulation and diagnosis, and what value they might bring to the picture. And then we just have a table that summarises some of the best evidence support for mental health and neurodevelopmental difficulties, as it says in there, a little bit on medication. And then we towards the end of this section, we just give some pointers on making referrals to specialist mental health services, because that can be quite a tricky pathway to navigate, and it can be quite tricky to know what you might need to put in a referral. So we just give some kind of pointers and advice on the kind of things to put in there. And then again, that section just finishes off with how you might monitor the impact of any of these types of support. So I think we're okay on time. I didn't clock exactly when we started, but if we maybe have another five minutes or so, and then we'll stop and have any questions. So these are the core overarching principles that cut across all aspects of the document, really. And I just wanted to unpack a few of these with you today. So the first one, absolute headline: mental health and emotional well-being of children and young people in care is everyone's responsibility. So we have this corporate parenting responsibility, but I think beyond that, we all have bits of the jigsaw. So we all have bits of the jigsaw in terms of information that might help us to understand the needs, might help us to understand what's underlying those needs. But also we all have a role to play in responding and supporting young people around those needs. And as I've already alluded to, there's a massive amount that people who are already in the young people's lives can do to support those needs. It's also of mutual benefit to everyone, because we know that when young people, even if they're not in care, when young people are experiencing mental health problems, that can have profound impacts across all areas of their life. So if everyone's involved in supporting them, it's going to have a knock-on effect in the area that professional is working in. So say it might lead to better engagement in school. Second point, again, really critical, we're about doing with, not doing to. So coming alongside young people, being really transparent with them, collaborating with them, checking in what their wishes and preferences are along the way. And a couple of headlines under that we flesh out in the guide is around just being mindful that young people in care can often be quite disenfranchised in terms of feeling like they've got choice and they've got agency in their lives. So we just might need to attend to that a little bit in terms of how best do we engage young people in team, joining the team and being collaborative in these decisions. How do we present information in an accessible way to them? How do we enable them to express their experiences and views, particularly in the context that they may not have had a lot of choice over some things that have happened, some really major things that have happened in their life in the past. And the other bit that we just flesh out a bit there is being mindful of the difference between compliance and consent. And this is perhaps more true for children and young people in care, but we do also see it for other children and young people where they're just used to going along with what the adults around them suggest. And that isn't true consent, that's compliance. So it's just a little bit of a flagging of that. Third point, and this really draws on some of the attachment based therapies actually, is just approaching whatever we do with acceptance, curiosity and empathy. And that cuts across the professional system as well. So being accepting, curious and empathic towards each other and not just towards the young person, and just making sure that anything we do around this is characterised by those three things. Just picking up on Beverly's presentation, inclusion, absolutely critical here. So we want to make sure that we are trying to facilitate equal access for children and young people in care to the kind of support and opportunities that their counterparts who aren't in care have. And we really don't want to be excluding young people from support just based on some of their characteristics. So whether that be their care status, the stability of their placement, whether it's around behaviours that they're showing, if they're showing behaviours that others find challenging, if maybe they're an unaccompanied asylum seeking child. We want to make sure that we're trying to do everything we can to facilitate inclusion and equity of access and make reasonable adjustments. Next point was just around looking beyond behaviour. So there are absolutely some young people in care where there may be some benefits to targeted behavioural support. But we also need to just be really mindful that behaviour is often an expression of need, an expression of distress. And so really just looking behind the behaviour to understand what that need and distress is. What is it that the behaviour is trying to communicate? And maybe that's what we need to target the support at rather than the end product, which is the behaviour. I think integration and joint working kind of speaks to itself, but it's really important to have this cross-agency effective working, and part of that really is just that ongoing dialogue between services around a child or young person, to give opportunities to share perspectives, share tips and advice, understand how each other work, and to really arrive at the most coordinated, multi-agency agreed plan that we can. No one size fits all. There are a couple of aspects to that really. So it's just there is no one fix. There is no one screening tool or questionnaire to use with children and young people. What we need to be thinking about is the young person in front of us. And so in terms of planning support, often it's useful if that's based around an overall psychological formulation of their needs. And what's underlying those needs. Often even for the same type of presenting difficulty, there isn't just one option in terms of a therapy or a treatment or an approach to supporting them. So we know that there will be variation in service provision between areas. Just because one particular type of approach might not be available in your area, it doesn't mean that there aren't other approaches that could be effective. And we've tried to highlight that throughout the report. I think the next point is a bit self-explanatory, and the final point, I'll come back to this on the next slide, but really about how central and how critical it is to build supportive adults around children and young people. So to equip the adults that are already in the child's life to be able to understand their mental health and emotional wellbeing needs and to be able to respond to those and support those as best they can. And actually that's often where the most effective and most impactful work is. And that kind of makes sense because these children and young people will have had disruptive relationships in their past, may well have had traumatic relationships in their past. So it absolutely makes sense that if we can work on the support that the people who are already in their lives and are going to continue to be in their lives, who they have relationships with, if we work on the support that they can provide, then that's where the biggest impact's going to be. And then the final point, which wasn't an overarching principle, but I just wanted to flag, is that mental health and emotional wellbeing needs are ongoing. They're fluid, they change over time. And so although we are focusing a bit today on how you might use this in your care planning and review processes, actually it should be ongoing constantly. So the care planning and review processes provide us an opportunity to do this, but actually those needs are going to change and evolve over time anyway. So we need to make sure there's some ongoing monitoring and review of that. I think, am I okay, Sharon, just to go through these last couple of slides? They'll be much quicker than the last two slides.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we're doing all right on time.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's just wanted to go through a few key messages from the document. So I've already alluded to a few of these in previous slides, but a wider holistic understanding of the child or young person's life is absolutely critical to understanding their mental health and emotional wellbeing needs, because there might be things in their wider life that are leading to those mental health and emotional wellbeing needs, But equally, any mental health and emotional wellbeing needs they have might be impacting on wider areas of their life as well. So it's that kind of two-way influence, and so understanding that can be really, really important. Health, wellbeing and resilience is absolutely at the core. So if we think about any of our own mental health and emotional wellbeing, our own health, our own wellbeing, our own resilience is part of what buffers us against experiencing mental health difficulties. And that's just as true for children and young people in care, but it can often be overlooked or downplayed. But actually, in terms of some of the clinical guides that are already out there, some of the evidence reviews that are already out there, it's often the most engaging and successful support. And actually, if we get that right, sometimes it can negate the need for specialist input, or as I said before, it can really complement that input and bolster the outcomes of that input. I've already said this, but I don't think we can emphasise this enough times. A significant proportion of effective support comes from those adults already in the young person's life. There is a really strong evidence base for the impact of consultation from specialists to support the system around the child or young person, including their caregivers, to understand and respond and support that young person. So there's a really strong evidence base for that. So it isn't lesser than direct work with the young person. It isn't a fob off. It's got a really strong, solid evidence base behind it. Next point. So it's absolutely understandable when you're faced with a young person who's had a really horrible life and horrible experiences to want to find them some support, and that can naturally lead to people thinking, well, they need therapy. By nature of everything that they've been through, they need therapy to help them to process that, to come to terms with that. And it's just not the case that all young people in care need therapy. But on the other end of the spectrum, being in care does not mean that there isn't going to be specific mental health or neurodevelopmental difficulties that young person's experiencing. In fact, we know that it's much more likely. And sometimes it can seem like some of those mental health difficulties are quite an understandable reaction to the child's background experiences, but it doesn't mean that they're then not going to benefit from a specific assessment, diagnosis, or some evidence-based therapies or treatments for those difficulties. I think probably the difference between that penultimate bullet point and the last bullet point is the penultimate bullet point is a bit of a stock approach that all children and young people with terrible backgrounds need therapy, and the final one is a bit more nuanced in terms of actually there might still be specific mental health and developmental difficulties there that really warrant some support and where there's evidence-based treatments and therapies. Last couple of points, and then I'll stop and we'll have some time for questions, hopefully. So you might gather a few of these are kind of soapboxes for me, so I apologise if I'm coming across a bit impassioned here. But often here, so the last bullet point on the last slide, sometimes we'll hear, oh, well, it's a really understandable reaction to the experiences they've had, so therapy isn't the right solution. Well, that's not entirely true. And equally here, often around children and young people in care, I've heard, oh, well, their needs are far too complex for the kind of treatments or therapies that their counterparts who are not in care receive for the same types of difficulties. And I think there's some real issues with that. So I think when we're talking about complexity, often what we're talking about is multiple needs. And some of those needs might intersect. But that doesn't mean that evidence-based approaches for specific aspects of those needs aren't going to be effective. But what it might mean is that they need to be part of a wider package of support where there's multiple elements or multiple components. And the other thing it might often need is for us to just consider adaptations or augmentations for the specific young person and their circumstances. So we might need to have a longer period of building the relationship in a therapy. We might need to think about how we adapt the resources so that they're more accessible to young people who have some language barriers. We might need to think about building in more caregiver involvement in sessions so that they can support things to a greater extent between times and show more sensitive, responsive caregiving. But I think one of the points of this is that you would do that for any young person anyway. So all we're saying here is that we should extend that option, that opportunity to children and young people in care as well, because it would be part of the approach we take with any young person. Last couple of points, and then I'm going to zip it. So sometimes we can put all of our eggs in one basket here, and it isn't all about attachment. but equally it's not all about mental health difficulties or neurodevelopmental difficulties. And so these two things are not exclusive. It's not either or. So a young person may well benefit from attachment focused support and a specific evidence-based approach for a specific mental health difficulty alongside each other. Now, we know that sometimes attachment focused support can have a knock-on beneficial impact on mental health. We know that sometimes specific mental health interventions can have a knock-on effect in terms of caregiver sensitivity, but sometimes you might need both as part of the package of support. We might need to think about the pacing and timing of those and the sequencing of those. But I think it was just to flag that they're not mutually exclusive, those two things. And the final point, which I said earlier, but I think is also really important just to come back to, is if we're thinking about packages of support that have multiple components or elements to them, it's really important that we have a psychological understanding to underpin those plans around those packages of support that really understand the strengths, difficulties and needs of the young person and what's maintaining some of those difficulties, so that we know that we're addressing the right things. So I hope that's all made sense. I hope that's whet your appetite for the guide. It may have been a bit impassioned at points, but hopefully that's been useful. And I'll try and come out of screen share now.
Gavin, that's been massively useful and makes a whole heap of sense, really. I think much of that, in terms of what you have to say about the importance of relationships, rang true with the, feedback that came back through from, our IROs as part of that research. What I'd add to that is that the guide is a, fantastically practical guide that, like you say, will be of benefit to a whole heap of, different professionals and workers around the child. So really worth, sharing that. And it is on the NIROMP, website, as well as the Health NHS, website. On the NIROMP website, it's under the IRO resources section. So really easy for people to access and use. So thank you. Pritpa, I'm just going to ask if there's anything coming up within the chat, if that's okay.
Yes, Gavin, we've got a good few questions. I'll try and summarise them, but I'll just go one by one. One of the frustrations being raised is about any sort of clinical resistance to providing any CAM service until the child is settled, and how that might exacerbate sort of mental health and emotional well-being needs for the young person, and obviously, developing attachments and relationships with carers, social workers, and others.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like it's a double-edged sword, this one, because there may well be some particular approaches that do rely on some stability, but we know that there are going to be young people where there may never be stability, which is really sad. But we know there's some young people in the care system where they are constantly going through different placements, and we need some kind of plan for them and some kind of support for them. I went to a conference a couple of years ago where someone was talking about trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy, and specifically around children and young people in the care system. It was quite interesting because they were saying that actually providing some of these interventions with adaptations that might be necessary might provide some internal stability for the young person, which might then have a knock-on effect in terms of the stability in their external world. So I think it can kind of be a two-way thing. External stability can create internal stability, but equally internal stability can create some external stability. I don't know if that addresses the problem. I think I'm essentially just saying, yeah, completely agree. And I think probably part of the action on the back of this is our engagement around mental health services with this guide, and what the implications of this are for services and access.
Yeah. And just another question, Gavin, fits alongside that one, is also the refusal to work with a young person because they've missed a couple of appointments, because obviously we know how difficult it can be to engage in the first place. Yeah.
So I suppose, couple of things to say on that, I suppose. One is, I think the last slide said about adaptations for the young person sat in front of us, and one of those adaptations might be, as I said, having an extended period of engagement, having a bit more flex around your did not attend policies. So most clinical services will have a do not attend policy, did not attend policy. I know certainly in the service I used to work in that there was a kind of two missed appointments and you're out rule, but there was a caveat in there that you could use some clinical judgment. And the clinical judgment comes in terms of if you've got young people where there are risks, or if you've got young people where you know that they're going to have some difficulty engaging at first. So I would hope that that's built into policies. But it might be worth asking, if you're having a specific experience with a specific service of this, it might be worth just asking them what their policies are around non-attendance, and just understanding whether it is a blanket two strikes and you're out, or whether there's some flexibility in that.
Okay. And just a couple more, Gavin. An issue that somebody's faced is maybe just focusing on the child's disability. So maybe just autism, ignoring the fact about the trauma that you highlighted that they're faced as well, especially when it comes to behaviour.
And I think that highlights the importance of psychological formulation, because that's where you're bringing in the overall perspective on the child's life and the child's presentation, to understand how all of these different things intersect. I think probably the flip side to that is that we know that especially autism, but some other neurodevelopmental difficulties, can often be overlooked in children and young people in care and written off as attachment or trauma based. So I think it's a sort of both and approach. We need a psychological formulation that understands their presentation in the round, but we do also need to make sure that we're not overlooking the presence of specific difficulties within that.
Okay, brilliant. I think the other ones have been picked up by Andrea and Lee, which is great. So we'll leave it at that. Thanks, Gavin.
Well, thanks for the time.
That's great. Thank you so much. So welcome, Lee Atkins. Lee is going to help us to look at and understand the screening for emotional and mental health needs and impact on outcomes tools and how best to employ them. And Lee is a regional officer for the Child Outcomes Research Consortium with, again, extensive experience and knowledge in this very area. So really grateful to have you along again today, Lee. Welcome.
Thank you, Sharon.
To you.
Thank you. Great to be here. Can you all see and hear me okay?
We certainly are,
Yes.
Kathy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
great.
you.
So thank you. I just wanted to put my slides up, actually. So we can use that. And can you see my slides now?
Yes.
All
Yeah.
good.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah. So a short way of introducing this is I want to talk about the role of outcome measures, both in the guide that Gavin's really covered really well, I think, really helpfully, but the role of measures ultimately in how we understand a child in care's mental health strengths, difficulties and their needs, and how we respond to those needs as well. So it incorporates screening, incorporates support, all these sort of things there, but the role of measures in doing that, that's something I'm very passionate about and involved in my work greatly. So as Sharon said, I'm Lee Atkins. I'm part of the CORC team, Anna Freud there. So I will share my details later. Please do get in touch. Please do check out some of the resources we made available, and I will speak to you after. Okay, so very quickly, these are two things I want to talk about really. I want to share some of the principles behind using these tools, these questionnaires really kind of bring home why we should be using them and how we should be using them really. And I want to give some time to Q&A. I'd really like to hear from you guys about any kind of challenges you have in using these tools, or any kind of experiences you've had, or thoughts or comments maybe. So please do feel free to put things on the chat. Equally, you can turn your microphones on when I finish in a short while and ask some questions there. That would be great. I just noticed there's a picture of me there from a couple of years ago wearing a shirt and cardigan, not too dissimilar from my shirt and cardigan I'm wearing right now. So it's obviously a style thing that I have. It hasn't changed for a couple of years, so there we go. Stability. So more forms. What I want to say is we are not about asking people to use more forms, more paperwork for the sake of using paperwork. That is not in our interest at all. We are passionate and committed to improving support and services for children and young people, mental health wellbeing, full stop. And we truly believe that by using outcome measures and feedback tools, things like this, they're one of the best ways we can improve our understanding and we can improve our support and services for children and young people. We are not in the business trying to get more forms filled in. We're certainly not paid for or kind of convinced by the developers of these questionnaires to get them used more often. That's not in our interest, but we do believe there are great benefits in doing so. And I want to kind of talk about what those benefits are really. So these outcome measures, these questionnaires as we call them really, they ask the right questions. the questions that we should be asking if we want to understand the child's kind of thoughts and feelings, their functioning, their strengths, their difficulties, their needs, really. That's all the questions we should be asking. We know they're good questions because they've been through a process of investigation and validation. So universities have tried them out, and research papers have tried them out, and the questions give good results. So we know they're really helpful, and crucially, they provide information that can be missed. This comes up in the research frequently, actually, if we don't use outcome measures, we just use our kind of own experience, things like that. We're asking questions and we're going to miss information that's really important. And I've heard countless stories from practitioners, social workers, teachers. They've used these tools. Actually, by using this questionnaire, it has revealed so much more information that I didn't know, even though I've known this child X amount of years. So that's really, really pertinent there. These measures are really helpful because they're called measures, in fact, aren't they? So to see whether anything's changing over time. So are things getting better, are they getting worse, or are they staying the same? And actually, it's very difficult to know that just by observing. So these measures really help us do that. And they certainly enable and put collaborative working at the centre of what we're doing. So they listen to the voice of young people, of children, young people, of foster carers, of parents, whatever it might be, their voice, and making sure their needs are heard. And remember why we're using them in the first place. While we're talking about outcome measures here, it's that understanding of a young person's strengths, difficulties and needs and how we respond to that. It's not just about diagnosing or stigmatising or giving young people a number. It's about that understanding. It's really helpful to do that. Okay, as I said before, I really want to bring home some of the principles that are in the guide and also in all the work that I do with services and practitioners. My feeling is that when I do pieces of work here and when I go out and about and meet people, they start asking me questions about outcome measures there. So tell me about the CGAS or the ORS or STQ, things like that, which is all great, and I'm happy to do that. But I really want to bring people's focus and attention to the page before. In fact, before we start talking about individual characteristics of measures and things like that, it's important we consider the page before in the guide and these kind of the principles for how we use outcomes tools with children and people and foster carers and teachers and things like that. As an example, you could probably select any questionnaire out there, and if you used it in a collaborative sense, in an explorative sense, and you interpreted it well, and you thought about timing, and you used it to garner multiple perspectives, you get much better results than if you used probably one of the best tools really badly. And I think I'm right in saying, actually, in my experience, going up and down the country and seeing services, that actually the latter is more common. Actually, there are tools that actually could be really valuable, but they're used quite ineffectively. So we don't want to blame the tool. It's just about using the tool in a manner which is conducive and effective. So it's about thinking about how we're going to use it to work collaboratively with a child or young person. So as part of a conversation, how do we use it to explore how a child or young person is feeling, or foster carers are feeling, things like that. How do we interpret the scores? It's not just about a diagnosis or a number, and how we kind of feed back to the child or young person or whatever it might be on that. The timing, how we use it over time, and how we might use measures to get the multiple perspectives across the network, child's network, if you like. So, birth parents, foster carers, teachers, looked after professionals, whatever it might be, social workers, and really kind of get that rich information there. But I think used in the way, you could use any tool really with these sorts of perspectives, with these principles, and get really good results. However, of course, we have kind of shared with you, as Gavin said, a good starting point for measures you might want to think about for what their needs are. So start thinking about the first column here. What do we need to know? Are we concerned about how a young person functions? Is it their general well-being? And it goes down there. And these are probably good, recognised, evidence-based tools that can help you there. It doesn't mean there aren't other tools out there that could do the job, and maybe you're using other tools quite well in your service, and that's absolutely great as well. This is not exhaustive list at all, but these are good starting points, if you like. Okay, skip past that one again. That one. Okay, so one of the things I really want to steer practitioners and services away of kind of using outcome measures as an admin task, really, or as a managerial mandated task. You must use outcome measures, things like that. So they become a tick box exercise. They're done because they need to be done, really. And that's kind of ineffective use of outcome measures. And that's not going to be great for anyone. The young person's not going to enjoy using them. The practitioner's not going to enjoy using them. And the data you get from them is going to be pretty poor as well. So instead, I kind of urge and I advocate that outcome measures are used to explore how the child, young person, foster care, whatever it might be, thinks. Help us see the world from their perspective. It's actually impossible to see the world from a child's perspective, really. But actually, we're going to do our best to think, how does it feel from their perspective? And the outcome measures are really helpful for us to do that. We want to use these outcome measures to listen to their wants and needs, their strengths and difficulties, all these things there. Really kind of that collaborative work, that listening exercise there. I think Gavin talked about this, providing empathy and validation, and really helpful for that. And to be curious about the child and young person, why they are. And that's really interesting about their behaviours, looking beyond behaviours, Gavin said there. Be curious about where does that behaviour come from, or where does that way of thinking come from, things like that. So this is how we advocate measures should be used. Okay, there's a couple more principles before I open up to questions. So it's not about a number. And I know from working with services, especially in looked after children's services kind of nationally, that often what we get is a number, an STQ number, things like that. And that's not very helpful. It's not about the number, it's about the meaning and the understanding behind that. And it's a shame that if it's just reduced to a score, it's kind of not helpful. So it's more than a number. Let's look beyond the numbers, really. In fact, you could use any of those outcome measures without even scoring them. It's the conversation you will have will be really rich. The scoring is really helpful for kind of tracking and measuring, kind of indicating whether needs are high or medium or low, all these sorts of things there. But actually, the conversation around the measure is as important, if not more important. The measurement should benefit children and young people, absolutely. We are doing this with the interest of children and young people at heart. They're the first and foremost, central to all this work. So one of our principles is don't use them if they're not helping children and young people. They may all be helping your managerial processes or your crop commissioning things or things like that, but actually they should first and foremost be helpful to children and young people and will direct work with children and young people. And they are if used with those principles in mind. Last two. Yeah, so embarking on using outcome measures, have a plan for how you're going to use the data and how you're going to feed back to the child or young person, or how the system is going to use that data, rather than just doing it for the sake of it, really. So have a meaning for doing it. And as we know, we're not saying here that by using one of these questionnaires, it's going to give you everything you need to know about the child. It's one extra piece of information that's going to really kind of complete that jigsaw, if you like. So your professional judgment is equally important as well as perfectionism across the system. But really, these outcome measures really are helpful to kind of fill the gaps in, to enrich what you kind of observing as well. So yeah. Okay, I've whizzed through that, and I haven't gone into detail about any of the measures or anything like that. I think it's got it in the guide. But I want to open up to any kind of thoughts, any barriers to using these tools, anything that's needed, any support kind of needs there, or any thoughts on these tools and how they might be used to develop this understanding of young person's strengths, needs and difficulties. Is there a starting point maybe on the chat? Anything come through on the chat?
We've got one question on there, which is just highlighting that there's very little partnership work with mental health services for young people if the decision's made not to offer an intervention or withdraw services, and then some of the issues with challenging that decision.
Okay, so is that how the information is shared between services and how it's used?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, Cesar might want to come in here, but I'm just reading the question. But I guess it's about if you're asking for a service and the decision is actually we're not going to offer one for whatever rationale that might be, in terms of how you might challenge that decision.
Yes, hello Lee. I think the difficulty is if the decision is made about not offering a service, there is very little for the IRO or the social work team to challenge that decision. So there's no discussion. It's made, and then we are left to deal with the risk and manage the risk for the young person when the problem is seriously mental health.
Right.
Is needed.
So really this issue is similar to what was raised during Gavin's kind of presentation, really, the system between health and social care, the kind of collaborative working process is not working very well if that's the case. There's no kind of the communication back and forth is not kind of working really well. So I think this is part of the improving the system thing we need to do here. So it's similar to a young person not turning up once or twice and then being sent away from camps, things like that. So the system needs to improve between the two. So I think that's something for us to take away and think about how we can do that. And one of the points I think someone made in the chat is how do we talk to mental health colleagues about this guide, involve them in this, and kind of joint working. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's really, been really helpful, Lee. And as you quite rightly said, there will be opportunities at the end as well. And do keep feeding in the chat. And again, we're very much saying to everyone we welcome questions, comments, going forward as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to move on then to have a think about the process and notification for out of area partners. And for this, again, I'm welcoming back Andrea King. And Pritpal, I'm just going to briefly introduce you actually, because we haven't done that yet, just to say that Pritpal is the regional lead for the southeast of England, so Nylon's regional lead for the southeast. He co-chairs along with Karen Cairns. Lovely, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to you then.
Okay, if I just kick it off really, this slot is really, there's no slides here. It's more about a conversation really, and what Andrea and I wanted to do was just talk to you about how you can use a clinical guide to support children so that they receive a consistent and timely service, and particularly obviously in terms of their primary and secondary healthcare needs when moving out of area. Now we know that each area will have their kind of own process for notification for out of area placements, and they're outlined in the care planning regulations. I guess the issue is in reality about those placements which may be more planned than others, and also some placements which might be made in an emergency. And what we can do in terms of considering that we're still getting the right placement and how we're working with partners within that in terms of our kind of placement decision making that obviously social workers will take part in and will have an involvement with as well. Andrea mentioned right at the beginning really about, corporate parenting, and I guess, our common interest is, regardless of where the child or young person might be moving to or where they've come from, is that they're receiving the right level of corporate parenting overall. And obviously when we're making decisions about, moving children out of area, they're challenging decisions at the best of times, and obviously we have to consider the child's, wishes and feelings within that, but also about whether that placement is going to meet their needs, and that's holistically, and how we consider that planning in terms of the discussions that we might be having with looked after children's nurses locally as well as within that area, and obviously like we might be doing with our VSK colleagues as well. The other part of this is about thinking about corporate parenting and the bit that Gavin mentioned within it about the overarching principles in the guide, and actually they fit corporate parenting. All the messages in there are exactly the same, to be honest with you, about how we look at things really and what support's out there. I think what we'd like to think about is about how the guide can support engagement in the planning and review process. So, if a child moves out of area, who are the right people involved in that review process? What are the conversations that are taking place beforehand and obviously before reviews as well as within reviews? And how as IROs we can, continue to promote stability, also safeguarding, but also thinking about permanency within that, because for some of our young people, they may move out of area for a particular period of time. They'll be coming back at some point. So again, it's a transition the other way as well as not just the first way, going out really. And also the other bit that, Andrea mentioned is about how we know whether the interventions are good enough, are the right type of intervention. And, the guide has been built upon some of the feedback, as Andrea was saying, around what IROs have said. And we know that it can vary. So about how do we bring that back, not just for that individual child, but also what we're seeing thematically. And obviously in terms of, the Southeast region, we're really keen to know what's going on, not just within my area of Kent, but what's going on for the others as well, because often they are the same issues. So we need to be able to draw that back in as well. So, it's really an opportunity to get your thoughts and thinking around it. And I'll pass over to Andrea. Really want to add anything to that, Andrea?
Thanks, Pritpal. You covered it really well. I was just going to answer a couple of the points in the chat, if I may, because I think they'll probably be at the foremost of people's thinking. So, colleagues, the CAM system is incredibly variable. Let's just be honest about that. And depending on which part of the southeast you find yourself, which part of the country or the region, how children in care are placed, what they receive in terms of support, but also the flexibility of those services to be child-centred and responsive to understanding the impact of trauma is really variable. So we're working with our CAMS colleagues in parallel to talking with you to say, look, here's what we need to work toward. This is where we need to go together. Can you come on this journey with us? Which they're saying, yes, they will. But it's going to be a huge journey for some areas and not too much of a change for others, depending on the sufficiency of what you've got locally. So bear with us as we work that through. In the interim, what we're saying to everybody is this engagement in statutory care planning and review, this kind of team around our children in care is really, really important. So this guide is there to try and help a little bit with, okay, so what are the things we need to be thinking about? How do we really understand the emotional and mental health need of our children? What are the interventions that are most likely to help so that you can keep pushing back with CAMS colleagues to say, we think this is the thing that they need, here's what the evidence is saying, and we will support you in those conversations. That's part of our role. And then think, as Pip has described, what then are we seeing in terms of the difference that we're making? Yeah. So is this having the impact on the child? And that's a core part of the way that we need to approach this. So thoughts and questions, things you want us to really consider. If there's a specific local issue, this kind of bigger conversation isn't such a good place for that. So we'll take that outside of the meeting. But generally, what is it that's you're thinking and what's most helpful for you?
And I guess while people are just thinking about that, Andrea's around, we're thinking about some of our young people may move into residential placements in other areas, about the judgments that we make about the location of that placement, and part of that is about what resources are there as well that might be provided from that provider, but also in terms of what's there in terms of primary and secondary supports as well. I've just seen something in the chat which is kind of relevant to it as well, but it may apply when children move out. It's just that somebody said about PP money being used to provide therapy. It's just moved out. It's moved up from my chat, so I'm just going to go back to it. Yeah, a concern is that children's PP money is often being used for the therapy shortfall from CAMS, such as not providing a service due to the child not being in a permanent placement. So therefore schools are securing this therapy.
Yeah, so that depending on the area in which our children in care are placed, the kind of range of provision will be quite variable. And what we're trying to do, I think we signalled this at the start, is level it up so that those areas who are very much reliant on what we would describe as the Tier 3 CAMS offer, so the mental health trust offer, with very little else around that, and sometimes it's quite an old-fashioned offer, so it can be quite inflexible, which is not good for children in care who have complex and multiple needs often. We're trying to expand that offer. There are a number of directors of children's services saying to us, this is how much we're spending of our own separate pots of money on therapeutic services. And what we're doing in that instance is capturing that money and working with the CCG commissioners who hold the mental health funding to say, come on, what can we do to provide a more comprehensive offer? Part of what we also need to think about is, can you see the whole offer available to children in care therapeutically, not just what we automatically tend to default to, which is the CAMS Tier 3 offer in our mental health trusts. Because sometimes we're missing key services that can be really helpful.
And an interesting one that kind of follows the early discussion is about, Tracy's put on there whether CAMS services could have a mission statement of services or agenda that authorities from the outside or other areas could have access to, about what they'll provide, how and what it would look like.
Hi. Hi, Andrea. Hi, Pritpal.
Hey, Lindsay.
I guess one of the things I was thinking is this, I mean, I'm absolutely your top fan about being able to have brought this forward and looking at how we're going to best support our children. And I guess one of the things I was just reflecting is one of the challenges we're still going to have, I guess, is when our children are placed in other areas, is how we fully understand they're going to need to provide that support. Well, that's the principle around this. But how do we know, because there's such variability between the areas in terms of what they have access to, with the support they can offer, how we challenge then if we want to raise a challenge. So within our area, our corporate parenting board agreed that our dispute resolution process includes all our partner agencies. So our IROs can challenge wherever they go. So if it's about CAMS, we can use that process to challenge. And I guess it's about how we link up with the different areas, whether that could be the same as to how we raise and have that knowledge and understanding of what their provisions in their services are. And I guess it's just thinking, I know in our area we've got a dedicated worker for the out-of-county children, so she will support us to then try and do that. But I just wonder how this process can assist all local authorities and all IROs when they want to raise the challenge around for their children, individual children, around getting the right support. I have a real strong issue with the fact where, and I appreciate different perspectives and different views around when children are absolutely in fragile situations, but actually that's why they need the support. And then yet the response is, they're not stable, we can't engage, or, we have one at the moment. So, you just think this is ridiculous. This is what they need. And so I guess when they're even out of county, that's more of a challenge. Sorry, that's more of just a statement rather than questions, but.
It's a really good response, Lindy. So there's a couple of things. The guide is really helpful for you. Picking up Liz McCauley's question, yes, all of our CAMS colleagues, CAMS clinicians, both those who are managing the services and those clinical leads across South East have received the guide. They've been working with us as we've produced it in most instances. So bearing in mind it's been Easter, give them a chance to have received it, but it's a tool you can go back to and say, look, here's what we're working towards together. Can we talk about this? In old money, the kind of disputes approach, the potential to be able to say to colleagues across the partnership, we're now formalising a challenge to you about the quality of support this child is receiving or not receiving, about what this child needs in relation to what's available or how we're working together, is really helpful. And one of the questions I think we've considered together as IRO managers for South East is, would it be helpful for us to build a picture of that over time so that strategically we can then be talking to CAMS leadership strategically across the South East to say, these are the areas that keep coming up. What can we do together to try and resolve some of these issues in order to meet the needs of our children more effectively? The last thing I'd say on that, Lindy, is for some areas, there really has been a lack of thinking about children in care's mental health needs. So they're starting from scratch and they're going to need time to build some of these services in. And we're seeing that work being initiated now. So we're supporting those areas to do that thinking. So there will be a little bit of bearing with each other as we progress together.
So, question. If there is funding, sorry, Pritpal, I will stop, sorry. As you all know me, I talk too much. If there is this funding to help support the development, if the specific CAMS does not have that service, could there be funding that could be provided to then outsource that for that child in that area for that specific point of time?
So the CCGs hold the funding for children's mental health, and we are increasing children's mental health funding across the South East and nationally as part of the NHS's investment in the long-term plan. What we're saying to all colleagues is, please, can children in care, their mental health needs to be a priority for this money. So there's a whole opportunity for us to be able to say, how can this small pot be used quite effectively for our children? And in some areas, and some of you will know this, your heads of children's social care or your directors of children's services will say, can we just put the pots together and create something that works for our children in care much better? So the answer to that is yes, and it looks different in each area.
Thanks. Thank you for that. I'll leave it to Gavin.
We've got Gavin's got a few points he wants to raise with that.
So thanks, Pritpal. I just wanted to come in with a couple of extra points on top of what Andrea said there about children who are placed out of county. I think one of the things that's really important to understand is the commissioning of the services. So there may well be CAMS services, but also specialist services for looked after children in different areas of the region, and really understanding what the commissioning of those is in terms of children that are out of area, and the work might be with commissioners rather than with the service leads and practitioners in those services. So I think that's one thing. And there might be differences in terms of the commissioning position for a CAMS team versus a specialist looked after children team. I suppose the other bit just to note with that is even where there is a specialist looked after children team, they're not likely to be able to meet the entirety of the mental health and emotional wellbeing needs of children in your locality anyway. So even if that team has flexibility about seeing children that are out of area, but the mainstream CAMS team doesn't, there's probably still some work to be done there. A couple of other points just in relation to this. So I think some of this also comes back to the point that we've really tried to emphasise in the guide, and I tried to emphasise in the presentation about the value and the evidence behind consultation to the system around the young person. So if there is a young person who's placed out of county, the best support may well be consultation and support and advice to the caregivers, to the adults in the system around the young person in this new placement, rather than a direct intervention with the young person. Very last point in terms of this thing about handoffs between different camp services and having to go back on a wait list and wait. I just wonder whether there's a little bit of an opportunity here, given that services have had to pivot to remote working over the last year with COVID, and I know there's a lot of conversations about services maintaining that as part of their offer. Now, that may well not work for some children and young people in care, but it may work for others. And so I think that does give us different opportunities in terms of maybe maintaining relationships with a CAMS team that you've already engaged with and you're already midway through work with, because they don't have to do all the travel and lose a day of working with anyone else. So I think there's probably some opportunities in there as well at the moment.
Thank you, Gavin. That's really helpful. We've got a few more comments in the chat, which I think we can probably answer. I'm just conscious, Andrea, Sharon, of the time, because we're due to finish at 11:30. Are you happy, Sharon, that we'll try and answer the questions in the chat?
Absolutely, that's absolutely fine. That's great.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
So in terms of perhaps Helen's point, Pippa, that would be helpful to pick up. So really good question about additional funding following the gap post-COVID. Yes, absolutely. So our surge of mental health need in the southeast is much, much higher than other regions, actually. We've got some of the highest demand in the country. What we're looking to do is then see how we can meet those needs in terms of the pressure that we've already got in CAMS services. So in some parts of the southeast, the increase just so far this year has been 107% rise in children being referred for mental health support to CAMS Tier 3. So your CAMS provisioning providers, mental health trust providers. In other parts it's 70%, and there's a few parts of the southeast that have got just 20% at the moment, but we can see it's on the rise. So the volumes are incredibly high. This happens to coincide with an increase in funding from the government via the NHS for mental health services. That's really welcome, but it's just part of the picture. It's not going to be quite enough on its own. So that's why we're trying to say, who do we really need to be able to reach out to with this new investment? How flexible can we be? And also, what's the partnership offer? So can we maximise more voluntary sector offer, for example, because our CAMS services in our mental health trust can't possibly hold all of this. So we make the best use of their resources. There's quite a lot happening in that space, and we can talk more about that or send you more information about that if that's helpful.
And a really interesting thing in the chat, isn't there, Andrew, about working with, looking at training and support and what's on the curriculum. So I see the answers for that as well that people can read. So yeah, that's really helpful.
Yes, that's a key consideration for us. And that's likely to work both ways. So we're looking both at social work training and also mental health vocational training, so HEI training for our mental health workforce at the same time. So we're trying to do both. You'll appreciate we're trying to do quite a lot. Just a few of us trying to do quite a lot. So do bear with us, but that's absolutely what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thank you. I think, Andrea, if you're happy, we'll hand back to Sharon after that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks ever so much, everyone. So moving on then, we've got, well, we're just at 20 past. We're due to finish at finish at 11:30. So really just before we start to come to a close, we wanted to provide an opportunity for people to think about next steps, any additional support that you would like to see happening as part of those next steps, and just for you to, you know, volunteer any additional ideas and comments that you might have. And I guess I'd welcome at this stage people just maybe turning their cameras on and you know, speaking, you know, as you wish to, really. So any thoughts and comments? Okay.
A group of IROs silence, that's just not
Yeah.
right.
Right. That's just not right. Okay, so we've got Tracy Cooper has her hand up. Tracy, do you want to come in? Wonderful, do come in. You might have your mute on.
Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now. Wonderful.
Okay. I was just wondering, the guide is saying about, you know, everybody's responsibility, and, you know, we as a network around a child, we all need to be supporting child, young person's mental health. And I was wondering whether local authorities could employ in-house mental health workers to support the network around the child with some of the lower level needs that might then relieve CAMS and the higher tier services of some of the pressure, and actually then the child may not escalate as high as, you know, that we can do some of that lower level work. Not that in-house practitioners should take on all that work, but they should be advising and supporting the network of that child, because there could already be a trusted person for the child that, you know, whether that's a carer or a key worker or black mentor, you know, residential worker, whoever that person is, that they could be supported. I know in Portsmouth our residential workers are supported by CAMS to work with the children and families, and it's a bit like, you know, what about the rest of our LAC children? Could we not have some support to work with the lower level staff? It was just something that came to me as we were chatting.
It's a really good, really good point, Tracy. So there are some practical things we could do. If this guide can be shared by all of you, certainly the next conversation that we're looking at together, and we're talking with directors of children's services and CAMS and CCGs about this, is the most effective way of working is to kind of try and close that gap between local authorities and CAMS. That works best where staff are either closely aligned or they're co-located together, they're working together as a team. And you've got some really good examples of some of that starting in Portsmouth, as you've described, and other people in this room will do too. So we're pushing for that kind of co-location thinking and for that offer to cascade down through the levels of need that children have, because our children care are absolutely a key priority for us. But before our children become children in care, they're normally in our children in need system somewhere, etc. And we need to be able to push that support back down through the system. An effective way of doing that is to build the confidence in our whole workforce where we can, and also have some therapeutic offer at a lower level within our systems. There are a number of examples of co-located local authority offers with mental health services, and if you want to see those, please do let me know.
Yes, that'd be really helpful.
Thanks so much, Tracy and Andrew. And we have, Andrea. And we have Andrew who'd like to raise a question.
Oh, I'll turn the camera off. Bear with me a second.
That's great.
So I put in the chat about whether or not we can look at ways in which we can actually join those conversations together. So looking at the referrals that are going into CAMS, having multi-agency referral meetings, so that if a child doesn't meet the criteria of CAMS, then we can have some more meaningful discussions about So what can be offered to this child? Is there something that CAMS professionals can suggest may well work for children? And kind of thinking of some processes that we already have in place, such as continuing healthcare for children. There are panels that are multi-agency and do have those discussions and really, really well. But it needs the resource and it needs the willingness of the agencies to think about work.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Andrew. Absolutely crucial. So there's a couple of bits there. The first is we've got a framework to help local partners design what we would describe as emotional and mental health triage system, which is very closely aligned to what you would describe as the MASH kind of arrangement, which enables that consideration of what's the emotional mental health presentation. And then what's the best
the two
option?
sections. I'm just
Sue, we can hear your conversation. Sorry. And then what's the best option in terms of support network for that child, particularly where CAMS Tier 3 just isn't going to be the option. And usually those wider partners sit on that triage. So we can, if you haven't got that already, you've got a kind of offer on the table that will help you do that. I know we're going into Isle of Wight just a couple of weeks to do that work. So there's that option. The other bit then is where's the coordination for what we would describe as the planning for children, and what are the mechanisms for that. So we fully support that suggestion. If facilitation support with that conversation is helpful, let us know, and we'll come to the table to support you with that.
Thank you.
Sorry. That's great. Thanks very much, Andrew and Andrea. I'm really conscious we've got about 2 minutes left, so we're running out of time. So unless there are any other burning questions, I don't have the chat line open, then I'm going to start drawing to a close, if that's all right. Any sort of burning questions on the chat line there just before I do, Prithpal or Andrea?
No, I don't think there are, Sharon.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Well, today has, certainly from my point of view, and hopefully for everyone who's managed to get along today, it's been a fantastic, session, which has really, highlighted the great partnership working that has occurred, as Andrea said at the start of this session, between various partners, not least our NHS partners, ADCS, CCG and CAMS, Anna Freud Centre, Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and of course NIROMP and the South East region. So this important initiative really does have weight and commitment behind it. We know as IROs what an issue this has been in terms of our children's mental health needs for so many years now, and absolutely delighted to see this getting off the ground. And as Andrea said, it will take time, but like I say, we do have the the full weight of key partners behind the initiative, and certainly there is a real appetite from NIROMP and those wider partners to roll this out in other parts of the in other regions effectively. So I just wanted to give everyone a huge thanks for coming along today. We will keep the conversations alive. We know that there's more to be done. As speakers have said earlier today, any questions, do feel free, comments, ideas, do feel free to keep sharing those. You can feed them up through your IRO managers, regional leads. You've got the NIROMP website, and we'll no doubt come back together in a future session in order to revisit progress and any additional ideas arising. But for now, if I can just again give a huge thanks to everyone that's joined us today, and to Andrea, Beverly, Gavin, Lee, Prithpal for contributing as speakers for today's session. So with that, I bid you all a really great day ahead. Thank you so much.